Thank you very much, Holm Keller, dear fresh women and fresh men. First of all, demographic change is a major topic in almost all countries of the Western world, particularly in Europe.
Take the mic up a little bit.
Oh,
more.
Demographic.
Good, super.
Okay, so I will take this one. I just would like to say that demographic change is a major topic in almost all countries, especially in Europe. And demographic change affects various areas of society, such as housing, such as the health system, which Jürgen was talking about, or public infrastructure. However, of great importance are impacts of demographic change on the labor market, which I will discuss in more details. Now, what is the starting point? The starting point is that there is a shrinking and aging population. And I will take Germany as an example, and why Germany is kind of representative for this trend in the demographic structure of the population. Now, what are the possible consequences I will discuss with you? There are at least 4 areas which are relevant. The first one is the financing of social security, the rising dependency. Second issue is the magnitude and the composition of labor force. And the third issue is economic growth and labor demand. And finally, I will also talk about mismatch of labor supply and labor demand. Now, what are the general trends if we deal with demographic change? The first one deals with the number of births by women capable of bearing children is constantly around 1.3 to 1.4. And what we would need just to reproduce the society would be 2.1 children per woman, which would be necessary. So we are far behind this figure. Second issue is the linear increase of life expectancies. It's good for all of us to have this expectation. And what is completely unknown, of course, and this is also relevant for all European countries, is the future level of migration. We do not know what will happen in this respect. Now, what about the population projections? What do we know about the future? And I just project the situation until the year 2060. And what we do see is that due to demographic change, the population will shrink. And what is very important, the so-called active population, this means people in working age between 15 to 64 years, will shrink even stronger than total population. What does this mean? This means that the age dependency ratio, especially for the German case, will also go down. Whereas in 2005, the relation of the proportion in working age and the population out of working age was 2 to 1. It will probably 1.2 to 1 in 2060. So we have a different relationship between the active population and population out of working age. And the main reason for this is the present age composition of the population, where we do see a rather uneven contribution. You do realize a mountain in this graph, and this mountain are the baby boomers, aged 40 to 55 years. And what you also see is that younger cohorts are getting smaller and smaller. And what I will do now is I will project, it will just go on 15 years later. What will then be the case? In 2025, baby boomers are getting older, definitely. So the mountain shifts to the right. And again, less youngsters in absolute terms. And what will happen in 2050? Baby boomers are then definitely out of working age. And the number of youngsters go down and down and down. And why this? Because the potential parents were not born. So that's the reason. So if there are less people, of course, there will definitely be less children. Now, what will that mean now for the labor market? It is not as easy as it looks like, because in the case of the labor market, we have to look at population, but there are other important issues like labor force participation and what I mentioned earlier, also migration. And let's start with a status quo scenario, only taking the change of population into account. And what do we see? A very sharp decrease of total labor force over time until 2060, from about 45 million in Germany of around 27 million. So that is a really, really sharp decrease. Now, what I will do now is I will show you some more scenarios in this respect. And the first impact I would like to look at is labor force participation. And the impact of labor force participation, of a higher labor force participation, is what you will see here, rather limited. So what are the issues with respect to labor force participation? On the one hand, this means a higher labor force participation of the elderly. They have now an underproportionate participation in the labor market, and the other group are especially women with children. So these are the two groups where we can really talk about a higher increase of labor force participation. And if we try to really to simulate this, we see the result here.
So these are scenarios where policymakers would do changes, and then this is how these changes will play out.
That's true.
Yeah.
And now I would like to compare migration with the impact of labor force participation. And this is a migration, a net migration of 100,000 per year. And what we see is that also if we take into account migration, the situation will not change dramatically. So the sizes are comparable. The only thing what you see is that migration in the long run is maybe the strongest trigger in order to deal with the shrinkage of the labor force. And finally, I will show you even more scenarios where we can then combine the different impacts and even maybe a stronger migration. And what we see is that, yes, the potential decrease of labor force can be reduced, but it cannot be avoided. So we have this impact, and this impact is relatively definite. What is also, of course, of importance is the age structure, what I mentioned earlier with respect to the population, which is also relevant for the labor market as a whole. And here again, we see two important impacts. One is a decreasing share of the elderly, the baby boomers I already mentioned, and what we also see is a lower share of young people and youngsters. They are getting kind of rare in the labor market. Now I will finally come to the consequences I was mentioning at the very beginning. First of all, if we look at aging, it means the increase of the dependency ratio, one can assume a higher expenditure for old age pensions, for health, we were discussing earlier, and for care. And this can lead, and there are, of course, if you look to the different countries in Europe, this can lead to higher taxes on the one hand, if the social system is financed by taxes, or in the German system will lead to higher social security contributions, which will then mean, on the one hand, higher labor costs or decrease of net wages, and both will harm the labor market and labor demand. And even if we decide to finance social security much more on one's own responsibility, that means it will have to be paid from their own purse, their own money, the available income of current workers shrinks. So that is another important issue. But what we do know is that the level of employment is definitely decisive. So that is something we have to look at. The more employment we have, of course, then the financing of social security will be easier in the future. Second issue is the magnitude and the composition of labor force. As I already mentioned, in the long run, total labor force will definitely shrink due to a strong demographic impact. At the moment, and this is very interesting, and maybe even in the near future, total labor force may even further increase or stay stable. We do not know really what will happen due to a high level of immigration from other European countries, especially from the southern part of Europe and also from the eastern part of Europe. But this situation cannot be prolonged. You cannot expect that this will go on because all these countries are in the same situation like Germany. Demographic change is also relevant for them. So from these kind of countries, one cannot expect much more migration. And aging of the labor force is already ongoing, which implies that the employability of the work-age population is getting more decisive. Now, what are the effects on labor demand, which is the other side of the labor market? Of course, a shrinking labor force puts less pressure on the labor market. But you shouldn't be too sure what will happen in the future, because such a situation must not necessarily reduce unemployment or generate severe labor shortages. Why that? Because economic growth may be weakened to less investment or less consumption. And because labor shortages may cause contrary effects such as more mobility of firms, they may go where labor is and workforce is available. That may also generate higher labor productivity or better working conditions and wages. So you cannot be sure that this will really be the solution for the labor market. And due to aging, what we do expect is that there will be shifts in consumption, which are very much likely. Certain services and specific products, both addressing the elderly, may gain in importance. Now I will just move to my final issue, to the final consequence, which is the matching of labor supply and labor demand. Because we have changes from both sides of the market. One, from the demographic side, as I already mentioned, more elderly, and of course also with respect to their qualification. And on the other hand, we have a change from the demand side. And this may lead to a situation where labor supply and labor demand not really match each other. And what will then be the consequence? The consequence will be then that there are more difficulties for firms to find suitable workers and for job seekers to find suitable jobs. And what we already see at the moment is a situation where we really see an increased competition of firms concerning young workers, which is great for all of you. We really see this competition because firms are looking at young workers, and they are also looking at what we call the so-called bright heads, indicating at least partially an employees market, which was more or less an employer market. So we see this great change. And what we also do is that we looked in our projections at the match of labor supply and labor demand, and where do we see the major discrepancies? We do not see them in the academic area, by the way. We shouldn't worry about the academics, so to say. But what we really see that there's one group where we really see problems, and these are skilled with an apprenticeship. And this is mainly relevant for people in technical occupations and also with respect to the health system. There we really see strong shortages already at the moment and maybe even in the future. And this is now my final slide, and this will give you an idea what might be relevant for the future. In my point of view, attracting additional labor is a major issue, a major challenge for the future. And what is of importance is definitely a high level of education. You are in the right institution here. We also need qualification. We need continuous training to strengthen individual work biographies and employability. So that is a first important issue. A second one is enhanced work incentives for families and the elderly, particularly regarding taxes, so you need the right incentives, and also with regard to social security contributions and benefits. And what we also need is, of course, flexible and affordable child care facilities and nursing homes, and also sliding transitions between working life and old age pension. And what is also important is, as I already mentioned, is the issue of migration. So what is important for all these countries which are affected by demographic change is to absorb ambitious migrants, so the so-called bright heads. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Super.